Okay, I'm fully expecting this to be yet another contentious GPU launch, so let's get straight to it. Take the RTX 2070 Super here, $500 GPU back in 2019. Now make it a ton more efficient, improve its ray tracing capabilities by a good chalk, add DLSS 3 frame generation, and you essentially have the new $300 RTX 4060 here in 2023. It's generally a faster card than its predecessor, RTX 3060, but the extent of its performance increases vary pretty drastically, kind of like 4060 Ti versus 3060 Ti actually. Bearing in mind the carnage of the discounting in the $200 to $300 GPU space, the value proposition of the 4060 basically varies according to how much ray tracing is important to you and how important DLSS 3 is to you. So just like RX 7600 from AMD, it won't be shifting too many needles in the frames per dollar charts, and its immediate predecessor also poses problems in the value stakes. After all, RTX 3060 is now cheaper than the 4060 generally, and it has 50% more VRAM in an age where frame buffer memory is becoming increasingly more important. And this pared back memory is a shame because the inherent advantages of the Ada Lovelace architecture are all present and correct on the 4060, and in the case of DLSS 3 in particular, we're seeing gaming feats on this $300 product that nothing else can get close to, and we'll get into more depth on this later, but for now, check this out. Cyberpunk 2077 RT Overdrive 1080p, DLSS quality mode, frame gen on, a 58 frames per second average at stock settings, and I was really surprised to see that straight out of the box the 4060 can do a path-traced Cyberpunk at perfectly reasonable frame rates. That rises to 79 frames per second average with the RT Overdrive optimization mod in place, which reduces light bounce for huge performance wins and only a minor hit to the overall quality of the presentation. Now, we're going to talk more about this later, because there's two ways you can look at the RTX 4060. Go by the benchmarks, and it's quote-unquote okay in some respects, undeniably poor in others. It's hardly spectacular in performance terms. It's ahead on ray tracing, but still struggling to match AMD's cheaper RX 7600 in rasterization. However, tap into the features where this card excels and it becomes a very different proposition, and actually unique in some scenarios. Question is whether those features, those new technologies, are a priority for you. Let's take a look at the specs, where similar to the RTX 4060 Ti, there's definitely the sense that the tech is kinda minimized, to say the least. Yeah, Q-to-core counts comparisons gen on gen aren't so valuable when we're dealing with different architectures, but even so, the 3,584 cores of the RTX 3060 gives way to just 3,072 in its successor, while the 192-bit memory interface drops back to 128-bit bus, limiting the amount of addressable VRAM the new card could ship with. The 12 gigabytes of the RTX 3060 seemed outlandishly high at launch, but it was the right call at the time when 6 gigs was the only viable alternative. The choices on our 128-bit interface are basically 8 and 16 gigs, and the need to bring in 4060 at a reasonable price point means that 8 GB is what we're going to get. Either way, we're seeing spec reductions versus the last gen product, and that's rarely a good thing, especially right now when so many key AAA PC launches are arriving looking appreciably worse on 8 GB cards. So in terms of the specific GPU we're reviewing today, well, it turns out there's actually no reference model for the RTX 4060, which is a bit of a shame. However, Nvidia supplied an MSI Ventus design, which is a small basic functional GPU with no bells and whistles. Exactly the way I like it for budget GPUs actually, because there's no need for high-end coolers with a card that has a 115 watt TGP, power delivered via one 8-pin PCIe input, so again, no need for any exotic PSU connectors here. Cool, quiet, basic, but fully functional with no real downsides. This is pure entry level and does the job just fine. And yeah, I'm told that this card does operate to reference specifications, but peak power draw is in the region of 127 watts, based on measurements using Nvidia's PCAT hardware interposer that sits between the PCIe slot on the motherboard and the GPU. Now, the efficiency of the RTX 4060 compared to all competitors can be quite extraordinary. Let's look at a couple of titles using ray tracing first, starting with Control, a game where RTX 4060 does not strongly outperform the 3060 or indeed the RX 7600. By dividing power consumption in watts by performance in frames per second, we get a new measurement, joules per frame, the lower the better, and this is a leveler for all tested cards. The 3060 here requires 34% more power per frame, rising to 58% for the 7600. Dying Light 2 next, more of a strong performer for the RTX 4060 up against the 3060, but power consumption is much the same as it was in Control, meaning better efficiency. The old Ampere 3060 requires almost 57% more power per frame this time, and that rises to almost 66% with the RX 7600. So that's how a strong and a weak RT title measure up. Now let's repeat the process with rasterization, starting with Forza Horizon 5, which always performs well on Ada Lovelace cards. RTX 4060 is still the clear efficiency winner, with the RTX 3060 requiring 55% more power per frame, rising to an extraordinary 73% on the RX 7600. So at these specific settings, the 7600 is faster, but you pay for it with much higher power consumption and lower efficiency. Finally, Hitman 3, which is a proven AMD winner in rasterization. Similar to the Forza test, the RTX 3060 requires 54% more power per frame compared to the 4060, but this drops back significantly to just 17% more power on the RX 7600. Still drawing a lot more power overall than the 4060, but you're getting proportionately more performance. So while it's still less efficient than 4060, it gets far closer to the new Nvidia card, which is quite interesting considering it's running on a higher process node. By the way, this one was tested at 1440p resolution as opposed to the others, which are at 1080p, and I did that as the RX 7600 seems to be CPU limited in Hitman 3 at 1080p resolution. With the preliminaries out of the way, it's time to look at game performance. As usual for benchmark purposes, we're using a Core i9-13900K paired with 6000 megatransfers per second G-Skill DDR5, run off an Asus Maximus Hero Z690 motherboard. Total overkill for a GPU like this, so later on you'll see actual testing with optimized settings based on a Core i5-12400F system with 3200 megatransfers per second DDR4, which I found to be a pretty good match for the capabilities of the RTX 4060 actually, and indeed every other budget-orientated GPU benchmarked in this video. I'm going to cherry pick results to give an overall view of the product, good and bad, but do check out the Eurogamer review with 1080p and 1440p metrics across more games and more scenarios. Kicking off the numbers, Mason, we've seen in prior RTX 40 series reviews that the new architecture provides the greatest generational leaps when looking at titles heavily reliant on ray tracing, which is where our benchmarks kick off and where RTX 4060 doesn't really disappoint. Intel Arc really lays down the gauntlet to Nvidia here, where we find the RTX 4060 eases ahead of the budget class Arc A750 and actually matches A770. You've got an average 30 percentage point lead here over the AMD Radeon RX 7600. In terms of the generational leap, a 22% increase over RTX 3060 is towards the upper end of performance boosts you're going to see with this product compared to its predecessor, and there's a 73% uplift over RTX 2060, which also sets the stage for a best case scenario up against Nvidia's original mainstream class RT card. Similar to Dying Light 2, if not more so actually, Cyberpunk 2077 is extremely heavy on RT features and also has the benefit of significant support from Nvidia itself. So in its category, RTX 4060 is kind of in a class of its own, almost knocking on the door of RTX 3060 Ti level performance, a 44 percentage point boost over Intel Arc A750, while you're getting twice the performance effectively compared to RX 7600. A 24% uplift to frame rates up against the outgoing RTX 3060. This also translates to similarly impressive comparisons against RTX 2060 with an 81 percentage point increase to performance. So we're going to see later on that this improvement does not extend to the rasterized version of the game, far from it. But once again, we're looking at a best case scenario for the RTX 4060 in this specific bench. Nothing else at its price point gets close to it, but really it's all about RT Overdrive. And yeah, that's pretty special and something we'll talk about in a bit more depth later. Worst case ray tracing scenario? Well, control. We've seen many times here in our testing on the Ada Lovelace line that this is a banana skin game for the new architecture, and here there's a good advantage to Intel Arc, with the A750 delivering an 8 percentage point lead over the 4060, which only musters a 17 percentage point lead over AMD's RX 7600. Meanwhile, just an 8-point lead over RTX 3060, which is a pretty poor showing. And this also means that in 5 years, the performance increase over the RTX 2060 is a mere 37%. It's not plotted here, but 4060 is still faster than 2070 Super, but even so, the variability and performance gains highly reminiscent of 4060 Ti. In some games you'll feel the difference, certainly versus RTX 2060, it'll be a night and day improvement. In other titles like this one, that 5 years just translates into a more iterative bump to frame rates. There's more RT benches over on Eurogamer, but just quickly, percentage differentials for 4060 in Hitman 3 are a touch better than Control, but a 13 percentage point lead across the bench versus 3060 isn't great, meaning just a 46% increase over 2060. RX 7600 actually has 80% of the 4060's performance here. Metro Exodus, another Intel Arc win, with A750 9 points to the better against 4060. That said, a 20-point lead over 3060 isn't bad, translating to an 81 percentage point lead over RTX 2060. So we're looking at a mixed bag then, but RT performance is generally where the 4060 produces its best results. In rasterization, the performance increases rarely hit the same heights, and in bandwidth-heavy scenarios, you might not even see any real boost at all over the 3060. Case in point, Cyberpunk 2077. 4060 can only match Arc A750 across the length of the benchmark, while the 7600 is a massive 22 percentage points ahead. There's only a small sub 5% lead for the 4060 over the 3060, which in turn means that we're looking at a pretty abysmal 16 percentage point advantage versus RTX 2060. I guess at least you are seeing game-changing performance up against GTX 1060, but the same can be said for basically every other modern GPU in the $200 to $300 price bracket. This is the nadir of 4060 in my benchmarks, but there are similar issues with Control. It's just not quite as bad. It's trounced by Intel Arc with a nigh on 17 percentage point lead for the A750, while there's just an 8% lead over the 3060. A 23-point boost over the 5-year-old RTX 2060 is also pretty abysmal. Perf boosts are variable, however. Some games, albeit a smaller amount, do see big advantages. RTX 4060 on Forza Horizon 5, for example, basically 22% ahead of the 3060, fighting it out against the RX 7600, where it has a small 6-point lead. Arc struggles on this one, I think because of memory issues, but looking back at prior 60-class cards, there's a 2.1 times performance multiplier up against RTX 2060, while, well, the GTX 1060 is just completely overwhelmed at this resolution with these settings. Hitman 3, we've established that this one favours AMD, so at 1080p there's a massive 30 percentage point lead for the RX 7600 over the 4060, while Intel Arc also scores a small win against Nvidia's new offering. 3060 to 4060, just a 9-point advantage for the new card. 4060 is 2.25 times faster than 1060 and 36% ahead of the 2060. Again, not great. The variation is truly remarkable, sometimes in a kind of good way, other times in a way that makes the 4060 look pretty mediocre or downright awful. A Plague Tale sort of fits in the middle, 14 percentage points ahead of the 3060, the 7600 leading by just 3%, while there's basic parity with Intel Arc. Prior gen comparisons aren't really that compelling either, 35% ahead of RTX 2060 with a 2.4 times multiplier against GTX 1060. Just when the mediocrity becomes overwhelming, things do look better with Returnal, where the 4060 is 21 points clear of the 3060, inches ahead of 7600, and has a 16 percentage point lead over Arc A750. The figures look okay until you look at the impact of mass discounting on those rivals. And yeah, a 40% lead against RTX 2060 and a 2.4 times performance increase against GTX 1060 on this one. Look at the numbers then and judge the 4060 on level pegging with its rivals, and it slots right into a range of GPU options that offer similar or better value depending on what your priorities are. So if you're not interested in ray tracing or the highest quality upscaling options, AMD has some excellent products. RX 7600 seems to have had another pricing haircut recently, taking it down as low as $250, and it's pretty okay at that price point if rasterization is your thing. RT, not bad either. Intel Arc can mix it up with Nvidia with ray tracing, isn't great at legacy games and has variable raster performance. Meanwhile, like for like, Nvidia RTX 3060 can be almost as fast or quite a bit slower than the 4060, but it does have the 12GB frame buffer that is sorely missed on the 4060. The one undeniable advantage for the new card is efficiency. There are remarkable wins here for the entry-level 40 series desktop GPU. Even so, I still see no clear winner here, except to say that Nvidia has specific technologies that can make a difference, and that's something that needs to be taken into account because it's enabling stuff none of the other cards could deliver. And remember, if it weren't for DLSS, there'd be no FSR2, no XeSS. If it weren't for DLSS 3, who's to say if FSR 3 would ever come along? Features do matter, and certainly Cyberpunk 2077 RT Overdrive is a potential vision for the future of PC gaming that's highly compelling. It's certainly the beginning of Nvidia's agenda in making PC distinct from consoles and in pushing forward graphics to a new level of realism via path tracing, enabled with a big performance advantage via its new architecture and accelerated still further with frame generation. At the beginning of the video I mentioned being impressed by the experience of this game running on the 4060 and how the RT optimization mod actually enables an experience that's always above 60 frames per second with a 35% performance boost in the official benchmark, and that actually seemed quite low compared to my gameplay experiences. So I devised this benchmark run around the taxing Cherry Blossom marketplace, and this time the RT optimization mod is delivering a 51 percentage point advantage. We need to capture with VSync off with DLSS 3 frame gen active, so do excuse the screen tearing, but you won't see that on a VRR display. But you will get similar levels of performance. And yes, this is running on a completely mainstream PC build. Core i5 12400F, 3200 megatransfers per second average DDR4 RAM. The RT optimization mod, devised by Aeroc and Scorn, works primarily by reducing ray bounce counts, and it's the same kind of optimization included as an option in Quake 2 RTX and Portal RTX, and it should be officially added to Cyberpunk. Primarily, the impact to quality is seen in reflections, and with a dimmer look to lighting overall, with a corresponding change to post-processing, but it's still very much a path-traced experience. And look, it's running very smoothly on a $300 GPU. As to whether that's a contributing factor to considering a 4060 purchase, that kind of comes down to whether we're going to be seeing more games like this going forward. Obviously, the Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty expansion will feature RT Overdrive, but we've got to see more games, right? DLSS 3, an interesting technology with a 4060 because it can definitely be an additive to the overall experience and can definitely be helpful within a mainstream PC. Here's a Plague Tale Requiem running at 1080p ultra settings with RT shadows disabled. Performance isn't bad at all on the RTX 4060, but as we saw earlier, it's not bad on a wide range of GPUs that cost less money. With DLSS 3, frame rates increased by 50 to 60%, and in CPU-intensive scenes like the market here, frame generation is taking you beyond CPU limits. It's a net win in my opinion. Plague Tale also opens the door to some interesting console comparisons. We've established in many game tests by now that Nvidia's RTX 2070 Super is broadly comparable to the performance of the PlayStation 5 GPU, but with this game we could match settings exactly. However, the recent update for the game increases console performance, but actually seemed to reduce PC performance a touch at ultra settings, at least by around 5%. So look at this. In our old test, PS5 now hits its 40 FPS cap when it didn't before. RTX 4060 is a decent match for unpatched PS5 performance on matched settings, but clearly things have moved on. So this new scene shows what happens when we find a new GPU limited scene on the Sony console. There's a 1 to 4 frames per second hit to performance comparing 4060 to PlayStation 5 on matched settings. Sopo Studio uses a native 1440p with temporal reconstruction back up to 4K. But obviously for 4K gaming, PC users have options. DLSS performance mode still looks good and moves you ahead of the PS5's performance level. Most of the time, you're actually in the VRR window at 4K. Now, whether it's down to memory or some other factor, I found DLSS 3 wasn't effective at all in these settings, but when we moved down to 1080p at Ultra, works a treat. I've also spent some time with my mainstream setup playing Marvel's Spider-Man Miles Morales. PS5's Performance RT mode runs in a 1080p to 1440p window with a reconstruction to 4K, targeting 60 frames per second. Alex put together equivalent settings, but I used DLSS in conjunction with dynamic resolution scaling instead. Now, I say equivalent settings, and there's a big asterisk there. They're not a total match, so we can't really bench as we did with Plague Tale, but the aim is to see whether today's $299 GPU can match the PlayStation 5. We're close, but the more I played, the more performance problems I noticed. I think at this point, we're seeing the 8GB of frame buffer memory unable to cope with the game's very high textures, which are in place on PS5. And this is something Alex pointed out in his game review. So I dropped back to high textures, which still look good, and also pulled back in RT object draw distance a couple of notches, which is our favoured optimised setting for a mainstream PC. Again, we seem to have clearer image quality than PlayStation 5, and both console and PC can slip slightly beneath the 60 FPS target in different places. Take those optimized settings into a native 1080p session, however, engage DLSS 3 frame generation and remove the frame rate cap, and suddenly Miles Morales is running beautifully with ray tracing at 100 to around 180 FPS max. So is today's modern budget GPU good enough for the Unreal Engine 5 onslaught to come? We need more games to test, but Fortnite is using the latest UE5 features, and typically high settings is broadly equivalent to the console experience. Either way, we're at a dynamic 4K here using TSR reconstruction upscaling, just like PS5 and Series X. Lumen and Nanite, those next-gen features, are active, and while there are some dips below 60 frames per second, the game holds up well on the RTX 4060. It's interesting to use the replay feature here to compare like for like with native 1080p unlocked. When 4K TSR dips beneath 60 frames per second, you can see some interesting performance differentials there, and I suspect we're looking at native 1080p upscale to 4K versus native 1080p without a frame rate limit there. Interesting stuff. What we've seen so far on Unreal Engine 5 is quite light on VRAM usage, relatively speaking, as it's using a virtual texture system, only pulling in the assets it needs at the quality it needs them. Seems to fit within 8 gigs okay. I'll be interested to see if that persists on other titles, starting with the upcoming Immortals of Avium. Either way, a pleasing result, and it looked really good at 4K on my LG CX OLED with variable refresh enabled. Something I did notice with Fortnite though, when I was actually playing the game, there were stuttering issues on the 4060. However, those stutters weren't present in the replay. Well, they were, kind of. The game hitched, but the renderer was still running just fine. So I think maybe what was happening in the original run is that we were seeing shader compilation stutter that was stalling the CPU and also momentarily pausing the recorded replay. Either way, the replay system is a pretty good way to test the GPU across various settings in a like-for-like manner. Going to round off with a couple more gameplay tests, somewhat more subjective, but certainly based on parameters set by the console experience. Metro Exodus Enhanced Edition. Ultra settings, no tessellation, no Nvidia specific technologies in play on this one. RT at the high preset, 4x VRS, as close as we can get to the consoles. But there are differences. Consoles use 4A Games' own internal reconstruction technology and dynamic resolution scaling, and there's no DRS on PC. Ultra on PC has less object detail close up compared to PS5 and Series X, as you can see here, but it does have more object detail further out into the distance. With no DRS, I opted to run at 4K using DLSS Performance mode, upscaling internally from 1080p. Worth bearing in mind though that PS5 can actually scale up to 4K from lower than 1080p. Even so, a 4K experience that looks good on a memory bandwidth constrained budget GPU with RT global illumination, running for the most part locked at 60 frames per second, with only the most challenging scenes dipping beneath, but still well within the comfortable bounds of the VRR window. It's pretty impressive stuff, I think. At 1080p, I unlocked frame rate, shifted to DLSS quality mode, and engaged everything: PhysX, hairworks, tessellation, and generally the experience in this most challenging of levels was still good. I stuck with the Ultra preset in terms of detail rather than extreme though, as that did tank the frame rate, as did hairworks, as you can see here, with frame rate halving when many furry beasts are on screen. Turn off hairworks and Metro runs very nicely at 70 to 90 frames per second in this highly challenging environment. Finally, Remedy's Control, a favourite game of mine, as you must surely know by now. I'd like to point out that the console ports of this were early work from Remedy, with a 30 FPS quality mode, upscaling from 1440p to 4K, and just using checkerboarded RT reflections and transparency reflections. I think we're going to see a lot more from Remedy on consoles once Alan Wake 2 arrives. Even so, on Control here, other settings are similar to PC's low, or indeed lower than that, with medium global reflections. Interesting stuff here, as the PC version was always highly performant on RTX cards. I've increased view distance, texture quality and texture filtering quality compared to the console versions because I can. I've matched RT reflections and transparency reflections, but these aren't checkerboarded on PC, so will be more computationally expensive. I've also used DLSS Performance mode at 4K, as I prefer the look to Remedy's 1440p to 2160p upscaling method. And yet I've also used the mod created by a Remedy staffer, which basically gives us a whole bunch of stuff, including the latest DLSS. Net result, a better looking game at 4K than the PS5 and Series X versions, and I'm mostly locked to 60 frames per second, with only the Corridor of Doom and the most intense fights taking us into the 50s. 1080p with DLSS quality mode, 4060 takes us into high frame rate territory with high RT features enabled. But you know what? The clarity of 4K DLSS Performance mode combined with the most impactful RT effects, reflections and transparency reflections, well, I'd say this is my preferred way to play the game. So let's wrap all of this up then. In my last budget 1080p GPU video, I demonstrated how aggressive discounting made the new RX 7600 from AMD look rather average, and it seems like prices have dropped in the meantime, presumably because 4060 is en route. I also showed that there was no clear winner amongst all of the GPUs you had to choose from, whether you prioritize ray tracing, raster performance, upscaling quality or VRAM. No one card could deliver a knockout blow over any other. RTX 4060 doesn't really change my conclusion, to be honest, but with RT Overdrive looking that good and running that well, and DLSS proving very useful, we end up with another card that specializes in certain areas while falling short in others. Again, there's no real generational leap here on average overall, and I'm troubled by 60 class losing a third of its memory against its immediate predecessor, something that comes at the worst possible time as we encounter so many games with texture quality issues, Diablo 4 being the latest example. Based on AMD being unable to deliver a similar card with a 12 gig VRAM allocation, perhaps it's just not possible for Nvidia or its rivals to do this, but it highlights once again how much of a disappointment 4060 Ti is in not offering more RAM at $400. If you're concerned about the texture issues, the choices available to you from Nvidia are the 3060 or a massively overpriced $500 4060 Ti coming next month. Alternatively, you're looking at older RDNA 2 cards, and yeah, they're more expensive than the GPUs we're looking at today. They can offer excellent raster performance, they can offer lots of memory, but they are lacking elsewhere. Meanwhile, Intel has just discontinued its $350 Arc A750 16GB model. Plenty of questions then, but no one product that delivers definitive answers that's reasonably priced for the budget gamer. And I guess, well, yeah, that's my summary of the situation. So, yes, that's the end of the video, therefore. Please do like, subscribe, share if you like, ring the bell for notionally instant notifications, and as always, please do consider our Patreon for early access opportunities, bonus materials, and access to our amazing, engaged, positive community. That's all from me for now on this one. Thanks for watching and supporting Digital Foundry.